Some speeches change the world. Others haunt the people who never gave them. Tom Hanks walked onto the Late Show stage on a crisp October evening in 2024, and the audience erupted the way they always did. This was America's dad, the man who'd made them laugh in Big, cry in Philadelphia, believe in humanity through Forrest Gump. 35 years of being beloved, and it showed in the standing ovation that greeted him before he'd even reached the couch. Stephen Colbert stood to greet him, that warm smile that had made him America's trusted voice for a decade. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Hanks, the only man in Hollywood who could make a volleyball an Oscar-worthy co-star. Tom laughed, settling into the familiar blue couch. Wilson deserved that nomination, Stephen. I was just there to bounce lines off him. They fell into the easy rhythm that made late-night television work. Stories about Tom's latest film, a funny anecdote about his grandkids, the kind of comfortable conversation that felt like visiting an old friend. Tom was a professional. He'd done this dance 1,000 times, knew exactly how to give Stephen the setup for a joke, how to time a punchline, how to make 40 million people feel like he was talking directly to them. 20 minutes in, Stephen shifted gears. Tom, I want to talk about something. 1994, the Academy Awards. You won Best Actor for Philadelphia. That speech you gave. Stephen paused, genuine emotion crossing his face. That was one of the most important speeches in Oscar history. You thanked your high school drama teacher. You talked about the AIDS crisis when most of Hollywood was still afraid to. You made people cry. Do you remember writing that speech? Tom's expression changed, just slightly. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but Stephen had been interviewing people for 15 years and he saw something flicker across Tom's face, something like pain. I remember, Tom said quietly. It must have been meaningful, Stephen continued, to win for a role like that, to play a man dying of AIDS when the disease was still so stigmatized, to use that platform too. Stephen, Tom interrupted gently, can I tell you something I've never told anyone publicly? The studio went quiet. Tom Hanks didn't do bombshells. He was steady, reliable, safe. This shift in energy was unexpected. Of course, Stephen said, leaning forward. Tom took a breath. That speech I gave that night, that wasn't the speech I'd written. That wasn't the speech I'd planned to give. Stephen's eyebrows rose. What do you mean? I had a different speech, Tom said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the studio lean in. A speech about someone who saved my life, someone I'd promised to honor if I ever got that moment. And when my name was called, when I walked up those stairs to that stage, I froze. The words disappeared, and I gave a different speech instead. He paused, looking down at his hands. And for 30 years, I've lived with the knowledge that I broke a promise to someone who deserved better. The audience was completely silent. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was confession. Stephen's voice was gentle. Tom, who did you promise? Before Tom could answer, something unexpected happened. A production assistant appeared at the edge of the stage, moving quickly towards Stephen's desk. She looked flustered, apologetic, but insistent. She leaned down and whispered something in Stephen's ear. Stephen's face showed surprise, then concern, then something like wonder. He looked at Tom, then at the production assistant, then back at Tom. Tom, Stephen said carefully, I need to tell you something, and I need to do it on camera because I think something impossible is happening right now. Tom looked confused. What's going on? There's a woman backstage, Stephen said slowly. She arrived about 20 minutes ago. No appointment, no ticket. She told security she had something for you, something you've been waiting for since 1994. Tom's face went pale. What? Her name is Jennifer Coleman. She says her grandmother was Patricia Coleman, your high school English teacher, and she has a letter. The name hit Tom like a physical blow. Patricia Coleman, Mrs. Coleman, the teacher who'd seen something in an awkward teenager who stuttered. The teacher who'd told him he could be an actor when he couldn't imagine being anything but invisible. Mrs. Coleman died, Tom whispered. In 1992, 2 years before the Oscars. That's why I couldn't. That's why the speech. Jennifer says her grandmother left you a letter, Stephen said, to be delivered if you ever won an Oscar for Philadelphia. She's been holding it for 30 years, waiting for the right moment. She saw you were going to be on the show tonight and she drove from Sacramento to be here. Tom couldn't speak. He just stared at Stephen. Tom, Stephen said gently, would you like to meet her? Tom nodded, unable to form words. Stephen signaled to his producers. The cameras stayed on Tom's face as everyone waited, 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Then a woman appeared from the wings, mid-50s, neat gray suit, carrying a worn manila envelope with hands that trembled slightly. She walked across the stage toward where Tom sat frozen on the couch. Mr. Hanks, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly running through her. I'm Jennifer Coleman. Patricia Coleman was my grandmother. She passed away in October 1992. But before she died, she gave me something. She said, if Tom Hanks ever wins an Oscar, especially if it's for playing someone with AIDS, you give him this. Not before, it has to be after. He'll understand why. She held out the envelope. Tom's hand shook as he took it. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed at the edges. Across the front, in careful handwriting, for Tom Hanks, to be opened after your Oscar win for Philadelphia. With love, Mrs. Coleman. She knew, Tom whispered. She knew I'd play that role. She died 2 years before I even got the script. How did she know? Jennifer smiled sadly. My grandmother had a gift for seeing the future in people. She saw yours. Tom carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the same careful script. He began to read aloud, his voice breaking almost immediately. Dear Tom, if you're reading this, then 2 impossible things have happened. First, you won an Oscar. I always knew you would. Second, you won it for playing a man dying of AIDS. And I knew you'd do that too, even though the world isn't ready for that story yet. But you'll tell it anyway, because that's who you are. I'm writing this in August 1992. The doctors say I have 2 months, maybe 3, lung cancer. Never smoked a day in my life, but here we are. I won't see your Oscar win, but I'll see it from wherever English teachers go when they die, and I'll be so proud. But Tom, I need to tell you something. Something I never told you when you were my student. Something I was too ashamed to share. And I need you to know it now, because if you've won that Oscar, if you've told that AIDS story, then you've earned the right to know the truth. You didn't just change my life, Tom. You saved it. In 1971, when you were in my junior English class, I was planning to kill myself. Not thinking about it, planning it. I had pills. I had a date, Christmas Eve, when my husband would be at his mother's house and I'd be alone. I had a note written. I was done. Why? Because 6 months earlier, my son Daniel had died. He was 19 years old, and he died of what they were calling gay cancer back then. What we now know as AIDS, though we didn't have that name yet in 1971. They just knew it was killing gay men, and doctors wouldn't touch them, and families were ashamed. My son died alone in a hospital room because his father disowned him, because I was too weak to stand up to my husband, because I chose my marriage over my child. And when Daniel died, I died too. I just kept walking around for 6 more months pretending to be alive. That's when you walked into my classroom. This shy, stuttering kid who sat in the back and barely spoke, and I gave you an assignment. Write about the bravest person you know. Everyone else wrote about presidents or soldiers or firefighters. You wrote about your neighbor, the man who lived alone, who people whispered about, who your parents said you shouldn't talk to, but you talked to him anyway. You asked him why he lived alone, and he told you the truth. He'd lost his partner to an illness and people blamed him, said it was God's punishment. And in your essay, Tom, you wrote, brave isn't fighting in a war. Brave is loving someone when the world says you're not allowed to. Brave is surviving when everything tells you to stop. Mr. Henderson lost everything and he still waters his flowers every morning. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Do you remember that essay? You probably don't. It was 30 years ago and you were 16. But I remember, because when I read it, I realized something. My son Daniel had been brave. He'd lived honestly when the world wanted him to hide. He'd loved when he was told it was wrong. And I'd abandoned that bravery because I was afraid of what people would think. Your essay, Tom, made me put down those pills. Made me think. If a 16-year-old kid can see the courage in loving honestly, then maybe I can find the courage to honor my son's memory instead of being ashamed of it. I didn't kill myself that Christmas Eve. Instead, I started volunteering at the First AIDS Hospice in Sacramento. Spent the next 20 years caring for dying men that families had abandoned. Every single one reminded me of Daniel. And every single one I told them, "You are brave. You are loved. Your life matters." I saved 43 men from dying alone, Tom, because you saved me first. Now here's what I need you to know. I'm giving you permission to tell this story. When you win that Oscar, and you will, I want you to tell the world about Daniel, about the men who died in the early years of AIDS when nobody cared, about the families who abandoned their sons. But I know you, Tom. I know you're probably standing on that stage right now, holding that Oscar, and you can't find the words. The moment is too big. The emotion is too much. The speech you wrote disappeared the second they called your name. It's okay. You don't have to say anything, because you already said it. When you took that role, when you played a man dying of AIDS with dignity and humanity, when you made audiences see him as a person, not a disease, when you made people cry for a gay man who lost everything. That's the speech, Tom. The film is the speech. Everything else is just words. But if you can, if the moment allows, say this for me. This is for the people who died before the world was ready to see their bravery. You were heroes, and you deserved better. That's all. If you can't say it, it's okay. You already honored them by telling their story. I'm so proud of you, Tom, not because you became an actor, not because you won awards. I'm proud because you became the kind of man who sees courage where others see shame, who sees humanity where others see disease, who tells stories that matter. That's who you were at 16, and I knew you'd carry that forward. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for making my last 20 years meaningful. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the story the world needed to hear. With love and pride, Mrs. Patricia Coleman. August 14, 1992. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Tom finished reading and couldn't continue. He sat on Stephen Colbert's couch holding a letter from a dead teacher and wept. Not camera-ready tears. Deep, shoulder-shaking sobs. The kind that come from 30 years of carrying guilt you didn't know how to put down. Stephen didn't try to fill the silence. He just waited. The audience waited. Jennifer Coleman stood nearby, crying herself. When Tom could finally speak, his voice was raw. I didn't know. I had no idea. That essay, I barely remember writing it. It was just an assignment. I wrote about Mr. Henderson because he was kind to me when other adults weren't. I didn't know it meant anything. It meant everything, Jennifer said softly. Grandma Patricia talked about that essay for 20 years. She kept a copy of it. When I cleaned out her house after she died, I found it in a frame next to a photo of my Uncle Daniel. The uncle I never met because he died before I was born. Tom looked at her. What was he like, Daniel? Jennifer smiled through tears. I only know what Grandma told me. He was funny, wanted to be a teacher like her, loved music, had a partner named Michael who held his hand when he died. Michael died 6 months later. Same disease. Grandma found them both and gave them funerals when their families wouldn't. She paused. Grandma said Daniel would have loved Philadelphia, would have loved that someone finally told the truth about what those men went through, about how families abandoned them, about how they died with dignity anyway. Tom wiped his face. When I stood on that stage in 1994 holding that Oscar, I had a speech written about Mrs. Coleman, about how she taught me to see courage in unexpected places, about a promise I'd made to myself that if I ever got that moment, I'd honor her. His voice cracked again. But she died 2 years earlier, and standing there knowing she couldn't hear me, knowing she'd never know I'd kept the promise, the words just disappeared. I panicked. I gave a different speech. A good speech, people said, but not the speech I'd promised. He looked at the letter in his hands. And now I find out she knew. She knew I'd freeze. She knew I wouldn't be able to say it, and she forgave me before I even failed. Stephen finally spoke. Tom, she didn't think you failed. She said the film was the speech, that you'd already honored them. But I didn't honor her, Tom said desperately. I didn't tell her story. I didn't tell people about Daniel. I didn't. You're telling it now, Jennifer interrupted gently. Grandma waited 30 years for this moment, not the Oscar moment. This moment, where you're sitting on television with 40 million people watching, telling them about Daniel, about the men who died in the early AIDS crisis, about the families who abandoned them, about the teacher who spent 20 years making sure dying men weren't alone. She stepped closer. Grandma didn't want her name in your Oscar speech, Mr. Hanks. She wanted her grandson remembered. And right now, millions of people are learning Daniel Coleman existed, that he was brave, that he mattered. Tom stared at her. Then slowly he turned to the camera. When he spoke, his voice was the voice that had narrated 100 films, steady, clear, carrying the weight of 30 years. Daniel Coleman died in 1971 at age 19. He died of what we now know was AIDS, though we didn't have that name yet. He died alone because his father disowned him, because his mother was too afraid to stand up for him, because the world saw his love as shameful. But Daniel Coleman was brave. He lived honestly when the world wanted him to hide. He loved someone when he was told it was wrong. And he died with dignity even though the world tried to take that away from him. In the years before we had treatments, before we had awareness, before we had compassion, thousands of men like Daniel died, and their families erased them. Their stories disappeared. Their names were forgotten. I made Philadelphia because those men deserved to have their stories told, their courage acknowledged, their lives remembered. This is 30 years late, but Daniel Coleman, this is for you, and for Michael, who loved you, and for every man who died in those early years when the world looked away. You were heroes, and you deserved better. He looked at Jennifer. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for bringing her letter. Thank you for making sure I finally kept my promise. The audience stood, not because they were prompted, because they understood they'd witnessed something that transcended entertainment, a 30-year circle closing, a promise finally kept. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling became the second part of this story. Tom asked Jennifer to stay. They sat in his dressing room for 2 hours. She told him about Patricia Coleman's 20 years of hospice work, about the 43 men she'd cared for, about how she'd told each one, "You are brave, you are loved, your life matters." She showed him photos. Patricia Coleman holding the hand of a dying man. Patricia Coleman at a funeral no one else attended. Patricia Coleman smiling at a pride parade in 1989, holding a sign that said, "Free Mom Hugs." She became the mother to 43 sons who'd lost their own mothers, Jennifer explained. She couldn't save Daniel, but she saved them. Tom looked at the photos with tears streaming down his face. I wrote about Mr. Henderson being brave for watering his flowers. I had no idea that essay would lead to this, that it would save someone's life. That's the thing about kindness, Jennifer said. You never know where it goes. You wrote an essay for a class assignment. Grandma read it and decided not to kill herself. She volunteered at a hospice and saved 43 men. Those men died with dignity because of her, and she did it because of you. She pulled out one more thing from her bag, a faded piece of paper carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, Tom's essay from 1971, titled "The Bravest Person I Know." "Grandma wanted you to have this back," Jennifer said. "She said, if Tom ever wins his Oscar, give him his essay. Let him see what he wrote before he knew it mattered. Let him see that he's always been brave enough to see courage in the places everyone else looks away." Tom read his 16-year-old self's words, simple sentences, a teenager's observations about a lonely neighbor who watered flowers every morning despite losing everything. "I wrote this in 45 minutes, he whispered. "I almost didn't turn it in because I thought it was stupid. I thought she wanted us to write about famous people, not some sad old man on our street." "That sad old man taught you to see humanity," Jennifer said. "And you taught my grandmother, and she taught 43 dying men that they deserved dignity. That's not stupid, Mr. Hanks. That's legacy." Before Jennifer left that night, Tom gave her something, the Oscar, the actual statuette from 1994. "I can't take this," she protested. "It's not mine," Tom said simply. "It never was. This Oscar was always for Daniel, for the men your grandmother saved, for her. I was just holding it until I could give it to the right person." He placed it in her hands. "Tell Daniel's story. Put this in a museum. Create a scholarship for LGBTQ+ students who want to teach. Do something that makes sure his name isn't forgotten. Because your grandmother spent 30 years making sure no one died forgotten. It's time we made sure she and Daniel aren't forgotten either." 3 months later, the Patricia and Daniel Coleman Foundation was established. Its mission: support organizations providing end-of-life care to LGBTQ+ individuals. Create scholarships for students pursuing careers in hospice and palliative care. Fund programs teaching high school students to recognize courage in unexpected places. The Oscar sits in the Foundation's office, not in a trophy case, on a desk, where everyone who visits sees it and asks about the story. And then they learn about Daniel Coleman, about Patricia Coleman, about 43 men who didn't die alone, about a 16-year-old's essay that saved a teacher's life. Tom Hanks speaks at the Foundation's annual event every year. He tells the story about the speech he didn't give, about the promise he thought he'd broken, about the teacher who forgave him 30 years before he knew he needed forgiveness. And he always ends the same way. "Patricia Coleman taught me that the smallest acts of kindness create ripples we never see. I wrote an essay about a neighbor. She read it and chose to live. She saved 43 people. Those people died with dignity. Their families reconciled. Some of those families now volunteer at LGBTQ+ organizations. The ripples keep going." He pauses, looking at the audience. "You don't know where your kindness goes, that paper you write, that hand you hold, that moment you choose to see someone's courage instead of their shame. You don't know who it saves. You don't know what it starts." Today, high schools across America teach Tom's essay, "The Bravest Person I Know," as part of English curriculum. Students write their own versions. They look for courage in unexpected places. They tell stories about people the world overlooks. And every year, the Patricia Coleman Foundation awards scholarships to 10 students whose essays show that they've learned what a 16-year-old Tom Hanks knew in 1971. Brave isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's watering flowers when you've lost everything. Sometimes it's loving when the world says you shouldn't. The 1994 Oscar speech Tom gave is still remembered. It was good. It was important. It moved people. But the speech he didn't give, the one Patricia Coleman knew he wouldn't be able to deliver, that speech changed more lives. Because 30 years later, Tom finally gave it, on The Late Show, with a letter from a dead teacher, and millions of people learned about Daniel Coleman, about courage, about the ripples of kindness that travel through decades. Some speeches change the world, but the most powerful ones are often the ones that wait 30 years to be spoken. Share and subscribe. Make sure Daniel Coleman's story is never forgotten.